Hello, and welcome to the February Crane Research Forum. Thank you for joining us today. We're so glad you're here. My name is Rebecca Dorr. I'm the Director of Research here at the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. My colleague Kathy is going to be monitoring our chat box today, and we'll be adding some housekeeping items there. We have these monthly forums to feature research on emerging or key topics that impact the field of early childcare and education. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Matt Brock. Dr. Brock is a faculty associate here at the Crane Center, a faculty affiliate at Ohio State's Niswonger Center, and an associate professor of special education here at The Ohio State University. Dr. Brock's research focuses on students with diagnoses of autism, intellectual disabilities, or multiple disabilities. He concentrates on inclusion, peer-mediated interventions, and evidence-based practices for educators and paraprofessionals. His current work at Crane includes a large-scale federally funded efficacy study of Flip Recess, a peer-mediated recess intervention. In 2020, Dr. Brock was awarded the Early Career Researcher Award for excellence in research on inclusive practices by TASH, an international leader in disability advocacy. Today, Dr. Brock will discuss his recent research observing social and play behavior at recess for elementary school students with significant disabilities. He will discuss findings examining differences between children with and without disabilities, as well as group variability. It is going to be a great talk. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Brock.
Thanks, Rebecca. I really appreciate the introduction. I also want to thank Kathy Kutsky, too, for organizing this webinar. I was just saying, done a lot of webinars since the pandemic started, and this is the first time that someone's monitoring the chat, someone introduced me. I feel like I'm doing way less work than normal. This is amazing. After we've had that lovely introduction, you know who I am, but I would like, if you have a chance, Kathy's actually going to put a poll up so I get a sense of who I'm talking to today. So when you see that poll, there's going to be two different questions. If you can go through and just let me know what capacity you currently work in. And second, if you can give me a sense of when you attended recess as a child, what's your memory of students with disabilities on the playground? Do you remember them even being there? Do you remember interacting with other students who also had disabilities? What was your experience? I'm curious to know that and how you're kind of thinking about the topic that we're talking today based on your own experiences. So what I'll do today is give a snapshot of what we learned so far from our work on Flip Recess about what the experiences of students with significant disabilities are on the playground. When I talk about students with significant disabilities, I'm talking about students that have a diagnosis of intellectual disability, autism, or multiple disabilities, and also have support needs that are significant enough that they either qualify for alternate assessment for students with significant cognitive disabilities, or for some of our younger kids, they're kids that we anticipate will eventually do that and need a modified curriculum as they go through school. I would be remiss if I didn't mention a couple things before we get started. One is none of this work would be possible without funding from the Institute of Education Sciences. So all the work I'll talk about today is grant funded and is part of a larger project. So today is really just a snapshot of what does recess look like when our team of observers just looks and doesn't actually intervene. We just want to see what the picture looks like then. Our project is focused on improving those outcomes. So frankly, what you're going to see today is not going to be a really cheery picture of what recess looks like. There's a lot of needs, a lot of social isolation that you'll see for kiddos with significant disabilities. Just want to be clear that our larger project focuses on doing something about that and testing an intervention to make improvements in those outcomes. I won't talk a lot about the intervention with Flip Recess, and that's not what we have data on for today. We're really early in this grant. So I'm just presenting data from cohort 1. But if you're interested in learning more about the larger project or what the intervention actually looks like, you'll see the website. It's actually in the bottom of this slide right now. Just go .osu.edu/flip. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in it. I also want to be very clear that the work that I'm presenting on today is not something I did all by myself. There's a whole bunch of people that helped make this happen. First, I want to thank my co-investigators that you see up here. So Ann O'Connell, Susan Lynn, and Laura Justice. And then the people that are really doing the work on the ground are the people that you're seeing up here. So this is the team of people that really helped us get the observations that we got the data that we're reporting on today. In particular, I want to thank Sarah Martin. I'm not sure if she's on the webinar today, but she's a PhD student now. At the time that we collected the data that you'll see right now, she coordinated Flip Recess and actually worked with Ann O'Connell to do some of the analysis that I'm presenting on today. So special thanks to her for doing that. Before I get rolling into the kind of overview of what I'll talk about today, I am going to revisit the polls. And it looks like, we didn't have a blank for you guys to put other to actually put, which looks like we have 25% researchers, some administrators, a few teachers, and a lot of other people that are in that other bucket. I'm betting some of those people are students. We didn't have an explicit one for that. So good to know we have that balance of folks. And it says when you attended recess as a child, it looks like 70% of you don't even have any recollection of somebody with a significant disability being on the playground with you. About 1/5 said they were there, but seemed like they rarely played with other kids. And 10% encouraging that some people are reporting, yeah, I remember somebody being there. And I did see them having some positive experiences interacting and playing with other kids around them. Those responses are actually really cool because as we share the data for today, I think you're going to see that there is some diversity in the experiences of students with significant disabilities on the playground. And it kind of maps onto those polling responses that some kids are missing in action, so they're not actually on the playground. Some kids are there, but similar to the response, maybe not having a lot of meaningful play interaction with other kids. But we do have some kids who are kind of defying the trend and are taking advantage of what recess has to offer. So with that, I'm going to give you an advanced organizer of what I'll talk about today. I am a teacher at heart, so this is how I give all my talks before I actually go into the details. First, I'm going to open up by talking about the importance of recess. Why should we even care about what's going on at recess? Second, I'll talk about prior research on students with severe disabilities at recess. What did we know before we started this Flip Recess project? Third, I'll walk you through research questions, methods, and results for how we collected our data, what we actually found. I'll summarize key findings and implications. And my goal is to wrap up with at least 15-20 minutes left in our hour talk so we can have a nice, rich discussion. You guys have an opportunity to ask questions. So first, the importance of recess. So probably doesn't surprise you guys to know that if you were to ask an elementary school age child, what's your favorite part of the school day? Most of them will say recess. What might surprise you though, is the data that we have that lends empirical support to how recess is really pivotal for development and actually predictive of future outcomes. So I learned that the US Academy of Pediatrics actually put out like a position statement on how crucial recess was, especially when there's been some public debate about like, should we eliminate recess, should we put more academic time? And they pushed back really hard by citing some of the really strong evidence about why recess is so important. Some examples of those things is recess is this opportunity, natural opportunity to develop social competence, build social connections. It's an unstructured environment where conflict is going to happen. Kids are going to have to sort out how to navigate that conflict on their own, cooperate with other people, share, solve problems in a situation that isn't heavily directed by adults. Something that I think is really cool is people have done longitudinal research that shows if you observe the degree to which young kids are successfully engaging in interactive games during recess, you can predict social competence and school adjustment in middle school and high school. And we're talking about variables like how many friends do you have in middle school and high school? What's your risk for anxiety and depression? How likely are you to graduate? All of those things we can predict based on the degree to which kids are successfully engaging in that social interaction. And like I said at the start, all of these reasons are why the American Academy of Pediatrics has pushed really hard for schools to still emphasize and include recess as part of the school day. The fact of the matter, though, is that we're worried that recess might be a missed opportunity for kiddos with significant disabilities. Based on prior research on recess for students with significant disabilities, there's reason to believe that our students have much lower rates of interaction. Sometimes they're not even in proximity to students that don't have disabilities. Sometimes they're standing on the sidelines, literally. Second, low rates of interactive play. So kiddos that are mostly playing by themselves, or in some cases only with other students who also have disabilities. And third, really low rates of anything that we would call positive social skills. And as you saw in the previous slide, recess is supposed to be this rich opportunity where I'm interacting with other people, I'm trying out new social skills. As they don't work, I'm adjusting what I'm doing. I'm watching how other kids interact and I'm picking up new things and learning them. Students with significant disabilities are the kids that most need to be making that progress on social skills and social development. But if they're not even meaningfully interacting with other kids, they're not going to be able to continue on that upward trajectory, at least not in an optimal way. There are some pretty serious limitations to existing research. One is all of those conclusions are from super small scale studies. If you're a researcher in special education, they mostly come from baseline, from single case design studies, where we have a really small number of kids and we're taking a really deep dive on them. And we've picked these kids specifically because we've seen a reason to intervene. A second thing is primarily focused on students on the autism spectrum. Certainly students with the autism spectrum benefit, but I'm really interested in more broadly, we have students with multiple disabilities or intellectual disability also that we see some similarities in profiles that we're interested in knowing about. Also, because the prior research is mostly from these small scale single case design studies, most of the data we have is on really narrow sets of behavior. And the biggest limitation is we don't have any normative data for peers without significant disabilities. So we have these data that show, hey, here's what we think are low rates of interaction and play, but we can't really compare that to what it looks like for students without disabilities. So those are really the limitations that I'm hoping to address in the work that I'm going to share from today. The other thing that I want to emphasize is that there's also another body of research that's focused on inclusion in other kinds of settings. And this is kind of laid the groundwork for the narrative I'm going to share based on our data. And that's this idea that in almost any educational placement that we're saying is inclusive, whether it's an inclusive classroom or is an inclusive lunchroom, there's this repeated theme of students who are attending the same class or they're attending the same lunchroom, but they're not meaningfully a part of the class and not meaningfully participating with peers. So some of you may have heard the idea of like island in the mainstream. So like I'm being mainstreamed or included in a class, but in reality, I'm sitting maybe in the back of the class with a paraeducator. I'm doing my own thing with them, and functionally, I'm not a part of the social fabric of the classroom around me. My peers don't really see me as an integral part of the classroom. I think that theme will resonate as we talk about the data that I'm going to share based on our own recess observations. So to jump into the present work, the research questions that we're focusing on today, the things that we observe for kiddos on the playground. First, to what degree are students with significant disabilities interacting and playing with their peers? And how do those patterns of play and interaction compare to typically developing students without disabilities? Second, in some previous research, people have suggested that sometimes we don't see meaningful interaction and inclusion because students with significant disabilities might technically be included, but they're not even close to peers. So like in classrooms, like I was talking about, maybe there's a student who's sitting in the back completely separate, maybe on the playground, the student is standing like with an adult far away from other peers. So we also looked at proximity to see, does that explain why we're seeing low rates of interaction and play? And then third, this analysis is super cool. I have to credit Zuya and Lynn for doing all this analysis. It's social network analysis that I am not an expert in and she is. But we looked at like how connected are students with significant disabilities to other kids at the same recess. And when we're talking about connectedness, we're talking about how many other kids said, yeah, that kid's my friend. And how does that connectedness compare to students without disabilities? So those are the three research questions that are going to drive the rest I want to share today. Next, I'll dive into the method, so how we actually collected the data. And when I say we collected the data, I'm saying that generously because the team that I showed at the beginning are the folks who actually involved work. The boots on the ground actually went to schools and collected that data. So the inclusion criteria, we included elementary students in elementary schools in Central Ohio across multiple school districts. To be included in our study, the kiddos had to receive special education services and had to either be eligible for alternate assessment or they needed to have a score of 75 or below, so about 2 standard deviations or below on a test of adaptive behavior. And the key thing also was that they had to also attend recess with peers without disabilities. I did not think that would be a major hurdle. I'll revisit that again later, but when we were recruited, I was shocked by how many schools said, well, right now, our students with disabilities are going out to recess only by themselves. We don't actually have an opportunity for an inclusive recess as with what we're doing right now. I am thrilled that in some cases we were able to work with schools and said we can still include you if we can figure out how to make that happen. In some cases we were, but just shocking to me that it seems like recess would probably be one of the easier times to promote inclusion, but not something that's happening in every school that we can talk to. Here's a snapshot of participants in the study. So we have 15 participants total in this first cohort of data collection. We have a lot more participants now, but this is the only cohort that I have complete data that I can share with you today. Pretty good balancing grade level as far as kindergarten through 5th grade, maybe a little bit heavier. You see there for 1st and 3rd graders, ages basically match the grade levels. I'm pretty proud that we have a relatively diverse sample when it comes to race and ethnicity. And if you go all the way down to disability, you see that most of our students, their primary disability label, about half was autism, and then the other half, mostly intellectual disability or multiple disabilities. In addition to our kiddos with significant disabilities, we did collect data on peers that we compared them to. I don't have all those detailed stats for the peers because we picked these kids randomly at recess. And we did it in a way that we didn't have to consent them individually. We can't go back and track who they were. So we just randomly picked those during the observation. During the observation, we split it into 3 sevenths. For the first third, we pick one kid. For the next third, pick another kid. For the last third, we picked a different kid. That way we have a pretty broad sample of what interaction and play looks like for kiddos without disabilities. So since we had 15 kiddos with disabilities, if we picked 3 for each student, and you see we have 45 peers total that you'll see that comparison data for today. Something I'm really proud of is how we collected the data that you're going to see today. We have actually an upcoming conference where some of my PhD students and I are going to present just on the observational technology to share it. I don't have time to do that today, but I'll give you kind of a quick overview of what we did. We actually used a system called Boris, which, as you see up in the upper right hand corner, stands for Behavior Observation Research Interactive Software. And what it is actually a free tool that was developed by this fellow at the University of Torino, who has been wonderful in working with us and kind of troubleshooting some things with us, where we have tablet computers that observers are going out to with at recess. That's a screenshot of that tablet computer is what you see there on the bottom right. And there are buttons on it, and most of the buttons do one of 2 things. One is you have like a counter to count how many times something happened and timestamp it. So every time one of our students communicated to a peer, we're going to hit, student to peer interaction. Anytime the peer communicated back, it's a peer to student interaction. So we're calculating those things separately by those button pushes. We also have kind of on-off switches for measuring duration. So we're interested in how long kids are involved in peer play, for example. So hit peer play, turns that timer on, it'll count how long, turn it back off when that peer play ends. And that's how we get those variables. We're collecting all this data live. Shout out to my team with being reliable with collecting this data, because it's really tough to collect all. There's a lot of buttons that you see there, but they do an amazing job. They also have a Bluetooth earpiece they're wearing in their ear, and there is a microphone that is on the student with a disability. The idea here is that we want to hear the interactions between our students with disabilities and other kids, but we don't want to follow those kids around closely and be an impediment to those interactions by having to be really close in order to hear what's going on. So if you're a sports fan, it's kind of like a mic'd up athlete where you get a live feed in your ear to hear those interactions. The other benefit of that is schools don't want us to record, audio of what's going on at recess. Then we're going to pick up everybody. And I don't want the responsibility of having the audio either. It raises some ethical issues. So it's cleaner and more acceptable to schools if we can do all of this in real time with just getting a live feed like a walkie-talkie and coding those variables. If you're a researcher and you're thinking, oh, this technology looks really cool, I want to learn more about it, please reach out to me. I'm happy to talk more and really connect to members of my team who are better experts at the day-to-day of how this works and how I have given. We use this for 3 full recess length observations per student. So we would go observe for an entire recess 3 times using this Boris technology. The key variables that we measured are some of these are already summarized. So we summarize, did you talk to someone else? Did they talk to you? I'm using the word talk loosely because some of our students didn't use speech primarily. So they might use sign language, they might use gestures, they might use a computer or other kinds of alternative augmentative communication devices. Any of those count as communicating with a peer when it's intentional and it's directed at somebody else. Another piece that we're looking at is proximity. So are you within about 2 meters of a peer? That's actually really hard to gauge that proximity. It's taking a lot of work to get folks reliable on that. Something that's complicated is on a playground, like on a jungle gym. Like you can be within 2 meters of someone horizontally, or like if you're underneath a slide, you could be within 2 meters of someone vertically. So there's a lot to keep track of for our observers. The other thing we're focused on is peer play. We're really seeing how high that peer play number is. We've defined this in a way that the student is either actively or passively engaged in play. The reason why we have passively is like if you're playing basketball and you don't have the ball, but you're running up and down with the rest of the team, you're engaged in playing, and that's peer play. So that's why we have that on the list. The other thing that we have in there that I'm going to emphasize is that we're looking for this to last longer than 3 seconds, so we're not rapidly alternating between play behaviors. And we're looking for behavior that isn't solely revolving around a stereotypic behavior. So if you're familiar with stereotypic behaviors for students on the autism spectrum, some common ones might be hand flapping or spinning. Any of that is cool. Like if you can play tag and you're hand flapping, that's peer play. We're only not coding it is if you're stopping to engage in that behavior, you're completely disengaging from interacting with anybody else. The other category that is a common one that we coded is solitary play. And this is anytime that our kiddos are following recess rules, but they're not engaged in play with someone else. And again, looking for something that lasts longer than 3 seconds. We're not judging whether play was appropriate or not. So if a student is just walking laps around the periphery of the playground, they're doing something, it's not revolving solely around something stereotypic, we're counting that as solitary play. They're swinging on their own solitary. The other 2 categories that actually didn't come up as often, but I'll go ahead and cover them now. One is stereotypic play. So this is when a student is not doing anything except engaging in something like that, hand flapping or spinning all on their own. If they're engaged in anything else, then we're able to categorize it in a different play category. And then that no play category is really for students who are not moving. So they're standing, not doing anything, sitting, not doing anything. An example of that we saw, this was on a day that was cold at recess, is a kiddo with like 5 minutes left to go in recess, went and stood with his nose pressed against the glass door, waiting to be let in because he was cold. So him just standing there still with his nose pressed, that would be no play. Interobserver Agreement. I'm really proud of the agreement that we've established on these variables. For reasons that I don't have time to talk about right now, but you can ask about it if you want. I think that we're actually underestimating how reliable that we are. There's some complications in calculating Interobserver Agreement when you're time stamping with precise timestamps and defining like what's an opportunity for agreement. But nevertheless, our agreement still is quite good, which you'll see up there, both for our variables for focal students and for peers. So that's it for the observational data that we're actually collecting at recess. The second kind of data that we collected was friendship nominations through social network analysis. So what we do, and this is a really onerous task, anyone on my team will tell you, but for every recess that we're observing, we ask every single kiddo at that recess, so usually it's the whole grade level. So for our kid with a disability is attending second grade recess, we're asking every second grader at that school, who are your best friends that go to recess with you and who do you like to play with at recess? And then we apply social network analysis to visualize how different people have nominated each other, how many connections are between people that said, yes, that's my best friend, or yes, that person is someone that I like to play with at recess. Some of you might be wondering, hey, you said that you had some really, some kiddos with some really significant support needs. Were they able to actually name kids? In order to use kind of principles of a universal design for how we had kiddos respond, we actually take pictures of every single kid that goes to the same recess. So back in my first grade example, first grade recess, every first grader. And then there, we've gone to actually having pieces of paper that the kid can flip through, and there'll be several pages, and they'll see everybody's picture in their class, and they can just circle the kids based on the questions that they're asked. So no requirement for you to actually be able to remember a kid's name or speak their name. And we found that's helpful not just for kiddos with disabilities, but kids without disabilities. If you ask a first grader, they'll tell you the kid that they like to play with, but they can't remember their name sometimes. So if we have pictures, it's super helpful for everybody. So without further ado, let's jump into the results so you can see what we learned from collecting that data. So Ann O'Connell, who's a statistician on this project, advocated for displaying data in these box and whisker plots. And I was initially resisting. Well, I haven't used these kind of plots in forever, but I am so thankful for that suggestion because it really does a nice job of helping us talk through the data. So what I'm going to focus on first is the data on the far left-hand side, which is called outgoing interactions. And if you look at the bottom, you'll see the box on the left is for our focal students, our students with disabilities, and on the right, you'll see is for the peers without disabilities. And outgoing interactions are any time that person communicated with someone else around them. So it could have been talking through speech, it could have been gestures, it could have been using a communication device. Any of those things could count. And if you look at the data that's actually inside the box, that's where most people are that we measure. So for focal students, most of that data is around 0. So most of our kiddos with significant disabilities, we're not seeing actually any outgoing interactions. But the dots that you see on there are actually the outliers. So those are kids that are outside the range of most kids that were at that low rate. So you see we do have a kiddo here that actually was about 3 interactions with other kiddos per minute, which is way different than most of the other kids we had with significant disabilities. In contrast, you look most typically to developing peers are having about 3 to 4 interactions with peers per minute. So a much higher rate, but you do see some variability there. You see the line here at the top, the whisker goes up. So some kids are having as many as 6 or 7, and you see an outlier here of a kiddo that had considerably less. So those means are really different, but there's kind of diversity in those. And I'll kind of delve in a minute some profile analysis that Sarah Martin worked on. It kind of shows here's where these tended to splay out, so you can see what that diversity looked like. Similar story for incoming interactions. How often did somebody come to talk to you? Focal students really near 0, although we had some outliers and peers much higher. And then the graph on the far right, that any interactions is just a sum of the outgoing incoming. So telling really the exact same story. Overall, huge difference between those two groups. I know this is a sad story to begin with, but it's even sadder when I tell you that the kiddo that had the highest outgoing and incoming and interactions for focal kids, that one that's really high, this type of quantitative data only tells you so much. That was actually a kiddo that was really trying to engage in play with other kids, and the incoming interaction they got back from them was really kind of negative. Like, no, we don't want to play with you. Go do your own thing. So the quality of that point that looks like an outlier actually is not that positive. Those differences between groups are huge. So if you're a researcher or a stats person, here's the stats that we actually ran t-tests on those group differences. You can see Because they are so big, even with our small sample sizes, they're much larger than what you would expect due to chance. And if you look at effect sizes down there, you'll see that those are enormous. Usually we would say an effect size of 1 is big. Here we're seeing effect sizes of about 3. So just enormous differences between interactions, rates of interaction for students with and without disabilities. Also, if you're a person that's into stats, you might be thinking, oh, t-test is a parametric test. You had a really small sample size, looked like it wasn't a normal distribution. We ran tests that were non-parametric also, same results as what you're seeing here today. If you reach out, I can share those too, but they really tell the same story, which is why I only have the one chart up today. Next thing we're looking at right here is types of play. Over here on the y-axis, what you see here is actually the proportion of recess. So what's the percentage of time that you were engaged in peer play? I won't spend a lot of time on this because the story is pretty darn similar to what I shared with interactions. As far as for our focal students, we see really near to 0% of the time they're engaged with peers around them. We do see some outliers. There are a couple of kids who actually are engaged in things that other kids are doing. Again, one of those points, not so positive, a kid that's trying, but not always successful in that peer play. But if you compare that to peers, you see that there's an enormous difference. At the same time, I think this hammers home the value of having normative data, because I think in past studies, people are like, well, peers are probably playing with other kids the entire recess. And that's not true. On average, we see that those kids are playing just a little bit under 70% of the time with other kids around them. So most kids are playing with peers for most of recess, but they're also taking some time to do something on their own, to go swing, to chill. So kind of hits home that maybe our goal should not be 100%. It should be maybe more similar to what we're seeing for the developing peers. If you look at the solitary play, you'll see that because the focal students were not engaged in peer play, most of the time they were engaged in solitary play on their own. So this is really almost the inverse of the peer play graph. And if you look on the far right, as far as no play, I won't spend a lot of time on that, other than to say that I'm sharing that with you because there's some unaccounted time for that's not captured in the first 2 categories. It's captured in no play, but those rates were so low that there isn't a whole lot to talk about there. And they're pretty similar for focal students and peers. Very rarely were they not doing anything. The test from the inferential statistics will match what you just saw, and where we saw those huge differences on peer play and solitary play, way bigger than you would expect due to chance. Similarly, enormous effect sizes, close to 3 for both of those, which is far bigger than you'd see in most studies. And also won't surprise you that for no play, we didn't see something bigger than we would expect to do chance because that number was really low across both groups. So one thing that we looked at was if we had really low rates of interaction and play, maybe that might have been because our students with disabilities weren't even close to their peers. Maybe they were off at another place on the playground. Maybe they're hanging out with an adult. Maybe we're seeing a similar story to what we see in classrooms where a student's seated someplace completely different than their peers. A little bit surprisingly to me, that is not the story that we saw at recess. If you look, if you remember that we're looking for within 2 meters is how we're defining proximity, that our students with significant disabilities, 96% of the time, they were within 2 meters of a peer. They just weren't talking to them and they weren't playing with them. Peers actually had a tiny, just a slightly descriptively lower rate of proximity. That's not a statistically significant difference. Really, the take home here is that everybody is close to other people around them. It's just that kids without disabilities are actually capitalizing on being close by interacting and playing, and our students with significant disabilities are not. So just interesting, this is a little bit different of a story where proximity can explain why we might have low rates of interaction and play. The next data that we're going to look at to me is the saddest. So this is where we asked kiddos like, who is your best friend? And Zuyung did this amazing analysis where I will admit, I'm not sure what happened in the middle, but when we're done, she gets this awesome graph that she shares with me. And what you see here, every dot that you see in here represents a student. The more connected that student is to other students, the bigger the dot you see. And the more central they are to the network, the closer they are to the center of that network. Students without disabilities in this group are represented in gray, or students with significant disabilities represented in red. You can see they're connected to nobody and they're way outside of the network. So really depressing picture. I do want to give you some optimism, which is that we're intervening in this situation. So our goal is to get kids more connected. All I have to share today was what does this look like without intervention, but we're doing something about this picture. I know it's a depressing picture to look at. The other common situation that we saw is that we might have a couple kids with disabilities. Those are those two red dots way up to the side, and they're only connected to other students with disabilities, and they're not connected to students without disabilities. They named each other as best friends, but nobody else named them. So I don't want to minimize that friendships with other students with disabilities are worthwhile and important. So I'm thrilled that they're connected to somebody. And I want to emphasize that in my own work, I don't want to break up that connection that you have to somebody else with disability. I want you to keep it. I'm just hoping that we can expand your network to also include other students without disabilities in addition to. Other things that we observed that I thought were interesting and really kind of drive home the need to do something about what's happening at recess is we never observed any adults making any attempt to really support our students with significant disabilities interact or play with anybody else. And that's despite the fact that in most of these schools, there was somebody who was like a special education staff person that was specifically going with the student with a disability. Those adults were kind to our students with disabilities. You could just tell that their understanding was their job at recess was to make sure that that kiddo was safe, that they're following recess rules, and that was really what they were limiting their role to. The other thing that we found surprising is I talked about before about being a struggle at some schools that didn't originally have so recesses. And we have to say before we intervene, you're going to have to send your kid to recess with students that don't have disabilities, so they have a chance to interact with them. It's even when kids did go to recess with their peers, we had nearly half of our sample that the way the school was set up and the way their staffing was set up is they were sending kids to recess with kids that were not in their grade level. So if you're a fourth grader, you might go to a second grade recess because that's how they had organized schedules. And I have some sympathy for some of these schools. Some of them are short-staffed. They're having trouble hiring special education personnel. So they're just trying to get through the day. But it's a really tough situation on kids when you don't have many social skills, you have trouble making friends, and then you get put in a recess where these are kids you probably don't even know yet. They're not even in your same grades. They're not kids you would see in any class that you're included in or at your lunch. The other thing that was interesting is when we would go to observe recess, sometimes the kids weren't there. So we had kids that were kind of missing in action. So at least 5 kids we would go, we would have to actually kind of prompt the special education teams like, hey, can you send this kid to recess today so we can go observe, making us think that when we weren't there, they probably were not consistently attending recess. So missing in action. Last thing I want to do is kind of pull together all of the data that I just talked through and walk through some kind of big picture key findings and implications, and then I'll open it up for questions, which I'm excited about having that dialogue with you guys. First, a similar story to what we've seen in other settings, which is that being in the same place is not the same thing as inclusion. So this is the same story that we've seen with educational placement in classrooms. So a kiddo with a significant disability can be placed in a general education classroom, but simply putting them in that room does not guarantee that you're going to have interactions or meaningful engagement with other kids. Exact same story that you're seeing on the playgrounds, that students with disabilities are on the playground, are really close to other kids around them, but extremely low rates of interacting with them or playing with anybody around them. So the surprise there was that it's not a function of proximity. Our kids are not going far away from other kids that are right next to them. Still, being in the same place, being really close to other kids does not automatically translate into meaningful inclusion. Second big thing that we saw, and again, I want to credit Sarah Martin for doing some of the work of looking at individual student profiles, is that there's actually more diversity in interaction and play for some of our kiddos than we expected. Honestly, from our pilot work, I expected to see everybody kind of universally near zero for some of these things. But really, just over half of kids were really at those extremely low rates of of interaction. We had a decent number of kids that had were kind of in between. So they might have moderate rates of play and interaction. And then we saw a few students had these discrepant profiles. So maybe they're trying to engage in peer play. They have relatively higher rates of interaction, and the rates of peer play are relatively low. This makes sense when I was talking about our one kiddo in particular that is like trying to engage in peer play, but is being shut down by the peers around them. We had another kid that just was sometimes successful in peer play on occasion, but not at super high rates. So you see that discrepant profile for those kids. The other thing I just want to talk about is that was a surprise to me also is how access was limited for kids with severe disabilities. I anticipated that we'd have some of these low rates of interaction and play. I didn't anticipate that 1/3 of our sample wouldn't consistently be going to recess and would actually require some prompting from us to be sure that they were going to be out in the playground. I was surprised that 1/3 didn't go to their grade level recess, making it really hard to connect with peers. If every year you might be put in a different grade level recess, you don't have the same benefits that other kids do. As far as I know these kids, I've seen them in class, I'm going to see the same kids on the playground. Exacerbates the difficulty of making social connections. But again, just want to emphasize that I have a great deal of sympathy for schools and how they're trying to do recess right now. And there are staff shortages. There's some student safety concerns, there's some scheduling problems, and folks are trying to balance those things. But I still think we have a responsibility to place kids in their least restrictive environment, whether it's a classroom or recess, and that means they're same age peers at recess. Other big thing is that really the school staff see recess as a break from any kind of real instruction and support. And this makes sense. This is how we think about it for kids without disabilities, to kind of let them do their thing, let them cut loose, and whatever they choose to do is just fine. But in this case, we often end up with special education staff kind of standing around the playground and a missed opportunity where you might have been able to support the student to be successful with socialization or communication. And we're kind of standing on the sidelines because we don't see this as an opportunity for intervention or instruction. It's kind of time out. And we want to change that to time in for our kids with significant disabilities. And this kind of corroborates in previous studies. We've asked people that are out there on the playground, what do you think your job is? And they tell us pretty much what I just said. That it's my time is I'm supposed to be here to make sure kids are safe and following the rules, but no more than that. So that wraps up the key findings from the study. I am sorry that I did not paint a rosy picture at all for what's happening currently for kiddos with significant disabilities on the playground. But again, I just want to emphasize, check out our website and you'll see the cool intervention work that we're doing. Really, the data that I shared today serves as an argument for how critical it is that we think about how can we really intentionally support students with significant disabilities in the playground so they are benefiting from interaction, play, and we see a positive social trajectory and also a positive growth and really building a network of friends that they know around them, both with and without disabilities. So with that, I will pause and take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Brock, for a fantastic talk. We have a lot of questions coming in the chat, but please keep adding them there if you have questions you'd like to address. The first question that's getting a lot of thumbs up in the chat is, can you give us a synopsis of the intervention you're studying to improve some of the data you showed us today?
I'm glad that somebody asked that. It gives me a chance to be positive instead of just telling you what a sad picture it is that we're dealing with. Sure. So I'm really proud of the intervention that our team has developed. It's called Flip Recess. It has two components. The most important component in my mind is the one that focuses on peers. So what we're doing is we're partnering with adults who are already supervising kids on the playground. Those adults are recruiting 3 to 5 peers without disabilities that might be interested in getting to know our kid with a disability better, having a chance to play with them and interact with them. We set this up in a way that it's fun for everybody, and that's how we introduce it to the peers. That adult gives those peers some really simple interaction strategies for how could you invite a student with a significant disability into your play? How can you talk to them in a way that you're going to have a conversation and keep it going? And how are you going to support them when they're not sure what to do? That training is really individualized, especially for kids that might communicate in different ways. So often, like peers might want to interact with a kid, but they see, oh, that kid doesn't talk. He carries around a computer with him. I don't even know what I would say to them. And part of that facilitator's job is to teach them, here's how you can interact with somebody who uses a communication device. It's not something that's scary. Once you get to do it, it's a lot of fun. The second part of the intervention is video modeling focused on social skills for the student with a significant disability. The idea is to really kind of prime them to use social skills on the playground. So we make these individualized video models that focus on really simple things like going up to a friend and saying hi, responding appropriately when they talk to you, keeping a conversation going, maybe playing an interactive game that they're playing at recess. The idea is they watch that video model, ideally right before they go out to recess. Here's a great example of this social skill. Here's exactly what it will look like at recess. That video has been videotaped with the peers and the student at that school. So they're seeing the video happening on the same playground they're getting ready to go out to. And then when they go out, they give it a shot and we check in with them afterwards. Say, hey, did you try it? How did that go? The idea with the peer piece and the video modeling piece is the peer piece should be really increasing the students' opportunities for interaction. And that video modeling piece makes it so they have the skills to really respond and engage when they are given those increased opportunities to interact. I can tell you anecdotally, data from what we have from our direct observations are really encouraging. Really high increased rates of interaction, increased rates of peer play, more kids naming our kids as their friends. Other just anecdotal things that are fun is our exit interviews with peers and the kinds of things that they have to say. They say things like, you know, I never would have thought of playing with this kid and I didn't know how to do it, but now that I know how to do it, it's a lot of fun. And just watching at recess, we have situations where like we started with 3 peers that we trained for a kid and they were providing the peer support. But by the end of the semester, you can't tell who's the peer support and who's not because they're kind of integrated into a larger group and like we all play together because this is what we do. And that's really what we're aiming for is making it just a natural situation where at first it's a lot of adult support, but we can fade out over time and kind of put kids on a trajectory of have natural, successful friendships, interactions with other kids.
Great. That's awesome. That's wonderful to hear. And we'll definitely have to have you come back and share more detail when you have those data ready.
I would love to. Much more positive talk.
Yes, absolutely. We have another question from Christy Conway. Is there a connection between the frequency of inclusion during other parts of the day and the frequency of inclusion during recess for these students you're looking at?
Christy, that's a really good question. So I don't have, like, it's not like we have run analysis so far that we can say compare. We haven't observed in those other settings. So I don't have data to be able to answer that question directly. That'd be an awesome study to be able to look at that. The one kind of data that we are collecting that will kind of get at this idea of what does it look, how do things generalize outside of recess, is we are talking with parents before and after we do the intervention, and we're asking them like, how often does your kiddo play with other kids outside of school? How often do they go to birthday parties? How often does anybody call your kid outside of school? And we're seeing if those things generalize outside. I would love to look at the classroom part 2, but we just don't have that data. Moving forward, and this, Christy, might be kind of what you're getting at, is like my work and really anyone's work around inclusion. We've done these targeted kind of piecemeal pieces. This focuses only at recess. Colleagues that do work focuses only on classrooms. And I hope that moving forward we can do more holistic interventions that are really focusing on inclusion across the school day. Because to be honest, based on anecdotal evidence that I've seen, I think what we're doing at recess might have an impact in the classroom, but I think it's probably minimal. I think you would have to put intentional supports in place in both places to see those differences.
Interesting, thanks. Another question coming in from Andrea Jarvis Galvin. What recommendations would you make for a school district that's in the process of developing an entirely new playground to promote inclusion? So I think talking about the physical structures there. We had another question about switching from a wood mulch or rubber mulch to more accessible fall surfaces. Like, how do you think about the physical aspects of the playground and supporting inclusion for these kids?
That's a really good question, and I didn't put stats on for kiddos with physical disabilities, but we certainly do have wheelchair users that are included. And it's amazing, like things that you don't notice about the playgrounds. I didn't turn off my Teams. Things that you don't notice about the playgrounds that weren't accessible, you start noticing immediately once you start playing with a kiddo that uses a wheelchair user, or uses a walker. So I think if you're starting from scratch, I'm not an expert in physical design of playgrounds, but I can just tell you anecdotally things that have helped us out a lot. One is some schools have had like communication boards that are like put in certain parts of the playground that have like different pictures, different play options and things to do. Sometimes they just sit there and nobody uses them. Sometimes kids are actually using them functionally to communicate with kids who might have a different communication profiles. So having one of those is awesome, but just having it alone isn't enough. You have to actually talk with your kids about using it for that to be functional. Of course, there's the piece around just having an accessible playground that a wheelchair user would be able to access different things that are there. What's been eye-opening to me that with some of this observation work early on is even playgrounds that are accessible, there often is only one way to get a wheelchair up and down off of a jungle gym. So like he'll go with playing tag and they'll go up and then like, oh, you got to go back exactly the same way. So it's tough. But hopefully it's on people's radars as they're designing at this point. And I'm excited that just newer playgrounds, just even public playgrounds around Columbus, I think are moving towards being more inclusive. The surfacing makes a big difference for power chair users. I actually gave a similar talk to this when I was at a conference in Arizona, and there was a parent there that was like, what do you do, when a kid gets their wheelchair stuck in the sand? I'm like, well, that's not a problem we've observed, but I certainly see how it could be if you're in Phoenix. But there is the issue with mulch. I think in general, our power chair users just steer clear of those areas, which is the reality. So if you're designing from scratch, talk to somebody who's a accessibility expert and see if you can avoid those materials. And even the other thing is just ups and downs off of curbs. Like you come off of the playground, you just have to step up a little bit to the blacktop that's adjacent to it. That can be a barrier for a wheelchair user also.
Yeah, thank you. We have another question from Lisa Hickman talking about the idea that inclusion is more than just a specific practice. It's really this like broader philosophy and part of the school culture, right? And she was wondering if you could talk about any staff perspectives that you got, either actual data or sort of anecdotally on inclusion, and whether you think there's a culture of inclusion in these schools, or whether schools with that really embraced inclusion as a philosophy, as a culture, would have different data on some of the measures you showed us today.
Yeah, so there we get really different perspectives from different schools, so really diverse set of schools that we work with. I think it would be fair to say there's a subset of schools that like inclusion has been a priority for them, and you can tell when you go out on the playground that maybe rates of interaction are low, but other kids know who our kid is. And when we recruit peers, we get people who volunteer quickly that say, yeah, I already know that kid, I would love to play with them more. We're still able to put things in place at schools that maybe didn't have that emphasis, but it's a little bit heavier of a lift. But it's just in general easier to recruit and put the intervention in place in schools that already had that philosophy. And like I said earlier, and I think this person is getting at their question is that being an inclusive school really means thinking about inclusion across the school day, and recess is only one individual snapshot. So unfortunately, it's all I can really speak to today with these data, but I agree, thinking across the school day is really where we should be going.
Absolutely, thank you. We have one question that again was given many thumbs up in the chat that we can end with here, I think today, but asking if you'd be willing, or maybe your students or staff, to come out and speak to school districts who may be not understand the importance or the significance of inclusive recess. People saying your presentation is really fantastic and interested in having you provide something like this in person for schools.
I would be more than happy to do that, and I can do better than that if you reach out to me and you're interested in putting the intervention in place. We're recruiting schools every semester for flip recess, so I'll share with you what things look like without intervention, and then I can immediately offer a participation in a project where we can get your school set up with doing something positive.
That's fantastic. And Kathy, I think shared your email earlier and it's up on the screen now. So definitely folks reach out to Dr. Brock if you're interested in that opportunity. Thank you so much for your presentation today. This has been a great learning opportunity and conversation. Thanks, Dr. Brock.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of our attendees for joining us today. When you leave the meeting, a really short survey is going to pop up. So please fill that out if you have just a couple minutes. We do really value your feedback and use it to inform future events, including, thinking about what topics we'll be talking about in future research forums. Thank you again for joining us and have a great day.